He is 22 years old. He steps off the helicopter with a brand new uniform, a map he has studied for hours, and 30 men who are watching him say absolutely nothing. Not a greeting, not a brief, just eyes. These men have been in country for months. They have been shot at, mortared, ambushed, and rained on until their boots rotted. And they are looking at this officer the way mechanics look at a new machine they already know is going to break. The question you probably have is simple: did he survive? The more important question is why so many of them did not, and why the army already knew. He has been in command for less than an hour. He does not know the terrain. He does not know what sounds matter in this particular valley. He does not know which of his men he can push, which ones he needs to read carefully, or what the previous lieutenant did that got people killed. His platoon sergeant is watching him from 15 feet away, arms crossed, saying nothing yet. The statistics are not on this lieutenant's side. Second lieutenants and first lieutenants suffered the highest officer casualty rates of any grade in Vietnam. The platoon leader slot was the most dangerous officer position in the war, and a significant portion of those casualties happened in the first 30 days. Most people, when they hear this, reach for the obvious explanation. He was young, he was inexperienced, he panicked or made a bad call. That explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters, because the real story behind what happened to new lieutenants in Vietnam is not primarily a story about individual failure. It is a story about a system. The picture most people carry of the Vietnam lieutenant comes from films, memoirs, and war stories with a specific shape. The young officer, too eager, too textbook, too full of classroom doctrine, gives an order that ignores reality. The grizzled sergeant either steps in to save everyone or watches with something between contempt and resignation. The lieutenant is the problem. The enlisted men are the competent ones. That image has enough truth in it to survive decades of retelling. But it leaves out something structural that was operating underneath every individual mistake, every bad order, and every lieutenant who stepped off a helicopter into a jungle he had never seen. The Army did not design the Vietnam platoon to be run by its lieutenant alone. The structure was deliberate. The second lieutenant was supposed to be young, recently trained, and technically competent in fire and maneuver doctrine. The platoon sergeant, typically a staff sergeant or sergeant first class with years of experience, was supposed to be the unit's institutional memory. The officer brought rank and decision authority. The sergeant brought field knowledge and the trust of the men. On paper, this was a functional partnership. In conventional warfare, against a conventional enemy, with stable unit compositions, this model had worked for decades. The problem was that Vietnam was not any of those things. The Army sent its officers to Vietnam under the same rotation system it sent everyone else. DEROS, date of expected return from overseas, governed every soldier's tour. 12 months in country, then you rotated out. This policy had a logic to it. Keeping individual soldiers in combat indefinitely was unsustainable, politically dangerous, and medically catastrophic. Rotating units as a whole, the way the Army had done in previous wars, would have required a much larger sustained force commitment than the political leadership was willing to authorize. So the decision was made to rotate individuals instead of units. Every man got his year. Then he went home. This sounds manageable until you look at what it did to the people still inside those units. A platoon in Vietnam was not a stable team. It was a constantly shifting population of men at different points in their 12-month clocks. A private who had been in country for 8 months carried 8 months of hard-won knowledge about this specific terrain, this specific enemy, and this specific unit's habits. He knew which trails got hit at dawn. He knew how the radio operator held the handset wrong and how that created blind spots during contact. He knew which squad leader pushed too hard on rest breaks and which one was actually sharp when it mattered. None of that knowledge was in any manual. It lived in the heads of the men who had survived long enough to accumulate it, and it vanished the moment those men rotated home. Officers rotated on the same system, but there was an additional layer applied specifically to them, and it made the problem considerably worse. The Army's officer corps was a career institution. Officers needed promotion. Promotion required a combat command slot on their record, specifically time commanding a platoon, a company, or a battalion in a real operational environment. Vietnam was, from the perspective of the Army's personnel management system, a career development opportunity. The solution that came from this logic was to cap individual officers' command tours at roughly 6 months in a given assignment. After 6 months, a lieutenant would rotate to a staff position somewhere else in the theater, accumulating experience across multiple roles. Then, a new lieutenant would take command of the platoon. What this created in practice was a platoon that might see 2 or 3 different lieutenants across a single calendar year, while the draftee private, who had been there since January, was still walking point in December. The men in the platoon often had more in-country time than the officer commanding them. This was not a rumor or a soldier's complaint about the brass. It was the arithmetic of the rotation system applied directly to the organizational chart. A private drafted in 1968, who was 6 months into his tour when a new lieutenant arrived, had 6 months of accumulated ground-level knowledge that the lieutenant simply did not possess yet, and the lieutenant was the one with the authority to act on it. The Army knew this tension existed. It had a solution built into the unit structure. The platoon sergeant was supposed to bridge the gap. An experienced sergeant first class, with multiple years of service and possibly prior combat deployments, was supposed to function as the lieutenant's guide through the critical early weeks. The new officer would lean on the sergeant's judgment during the transition. The sergeant would communicate the unit's accumulated knowledge upward to the officer who now needed it. The lieutenant would use his authority informed by that knowledge rather than in spite of it. Give it 2 to 4 weeks. The lieutenant would find his footing. The sergeant would assess whether this particular officer was someone the men could follow. A working relationship would develop. The system was designed to absorb the knowledge gap on the assumption that the gap was temporary. In a number of cases, this worked. Veterans' accounts are full of lieutenants who arrived knowing almost nothing and survived their first month because a competent platoon sergeant quietly managed the transition. The sergeant would tell the lieutenant which map coordinates reflected current reality and which were outdated. He would brief him on enemy movement patterns in this particular sector. He would read the lieutenant's face during the first moment of contact and decide in real time how much to step in and how much to hold back. He would communicate to the men, in the way experienced sergeants communicate without needing words, that this lieutenant was still being evaluated and that the evaluation was ongoing. Some lieutenants passed that evaluation. Some passed it faster than anyone expected, but the system had its own failure points, and some of them were structural rather than personal. The platoon sergeant was also subject to the rotation system. A sergeant with fewer than 60 days remaining in his tour was frequently pulled from field operations, standard practice to avoid losing experienced personnel unnecessarily in the late stages of a deployment. If the platoon sergeant's DEROS was approaching at the same moment a new lieutenant arrived, the safety net could be partially or entirely absent. A new officer and a temporary or outgoing sergeant in the same platoon at the same time created a knowledge vacuum at the command level that no amount of written doctrine could instantly fill. The two people who were supposed to hold the unit together during a transition were sometimes both in transition simultaneously. There was also the question of what happened during the formal handover between outgoing and incoming officers, if there was a handover at all. The outgoing lieutenant, when he was present for the transfer, which was not guaranteed, typically had a short window to brief his replacement. A few hours, sometimes less. The knowledge that had taken months to accumulate got compressed into a single conversation between a man who was mentally already on the plane home and a man who had not yet understood enough about the situation to know which questions to ask. The incoming lieutenant received the map overlays, the radio frequencies, the patrol schedules, the names of his squad leaders. What he did not receive was the texture of the place, the specific sounds that mattered, the specific silences that should never be ignored, the specific behaviors his men would show under different kinds of pressure. That texture could not be briefed. It had to be lived through. And living through it was the dangerous part. The FNG dynamic, friggin' new guy, was real and documented across dozens of memoirs and oral histories from Vietnam veterans. It applied to all new arrivals at the platoon level, but it carried extra weight for officers. Veterans had learned, through experience and loss, that new men were statistically more likely to become casualties in their early weeks in the field. The instinct to keep emotional distance from someone who might not survive the next month was not cruelty. It was a form of psychological protection that the specific conditions of that war had made almost necessary. A new private could be gradually integrated into the social structure of a platoon while keeping a relatively low profile during his initial period. A new lieutenant could not keep a low profile. He was in command on day one, hour one, whether he was ready or not. This meant the new lieutenant was simultaneously visible, being evaluated by every man in the platoon, and making decisions that had direct consequences for people's lives, all before he had the knowledge base to make those decisions confidently. His first patrol was his most dangerous operational moment. He was reading terrain he had never walked before. He was working with a radio operator whose communication habits and tendencies he did not know yet. He was calling in position reports to higher headquarters, using coordinates he had to double-check, because he was not yet certain enough of his own map reading to trust himself without verification. And the men moving behind him were watching every decision, noting every hesitation, measuring every choice against their memory of what the previous lieutenant had done right and what he had done wrong. The margin for error was narrow, and the cost of an error was not a low evaluation score. It was a body. The Army's own internal studies and after-action reviews, conducted during the war, identified the first 30 days as the peak risk period for incoming personnel, including junior officers. This was a documented institutional pattern, not an anecdote. The question, the one that veterans raised in surveys, that junior officers wrote about in letters home, and that career officers debated in professional military education settings for years afterward, was what could realistically be done about it. And the answer the Army produced was complicated by everything the rotation system had been designed to accomplish in the first place. Changing the individual rotation system would have required extending tours. Extending tours was politically radioactive in a war the American public was already deeply divided over by the late 1960s. It was also medically and psychologically problematic. Soldiers in extended combat deployments showed stress and psychiatric indicators that the Army's medical establishment could not dismiss. Rotating units as complete entities, the way earlier American wars had been fought, would have required a sustained force structure that the political constraints of the Vietnam commitment made impossible to authorize. So the rotation system stayed. Individual DEROS dates continued. New lieutenants kept arriving at units already in the field, already in contact, already depleted, and already carrying the quiet skepticism that came from watching the officer slot turn over repeatedly, while the war itself stayed exactly the same. Some units developed informal solutions at the local level. A company commander with good judgment might unofficially hold a new lieutenant back from full field operations for a few days, letting him shadow experienced officers before assuming independent command of his platoon. A platoon sergeant, who understood both his job and the situation, might essentially manage the first patrol while allowing the lieutenant to observe, absorb, and ask questions without the pressure of being the decision-maker every moment. Some battalions built brief informal orientation periods that gave newly arrived officers a few days to get their bearings before the full weight of command shifted to them. These solutions worked when the commanders implementing them had the authority, the operational space, and the institutional confidence to prioritize them. When those conditions were not present, when operational tempo was high, when the battalion was under strength, and every officer was needed in his slot immediately, when the metrics being tracked at higher headquarters rewarded patrol activity over officer integration, the new lieutenant went directly into the field. He received whatever brief the outgoing officer could give him. He shook hands with his platoon sergeant, and the first week began in full, without a grace period, and without anyone formally acknowledging that what he was about to walk into was the most statistically dangerous phase of his entire tour. The career management incentive complicated this further, in ways that even senior officers acknowledged at the time. A lieutenant, who spent a week in an informal rear area orientation, was a lieutenant who was not accumulating command time against his 6-month clock. Every day spent getting oriented was a day not counted toward the career development milestone that the Army's promotion system required. This created pressure, sometimes from above, sometimes self-generated by officers who understood how the system worked, to get into the field as quickly as possible and start the command tour clock. The Army's personnel management goals and the operational needs of the platoon were pointing in different directions. The lieutenant was standing at exactly that intersection on the day he arrived. The officers who survived their first week and went on to earn genuine trust from their men describe a specific turning point in most of their accounts. It was rarely a dramatic tactical moment. It was not a firefight in which the lieutenant performed brilliantly under pressure and suddenly won everyone over. In a majority of the accounts, the shift was quieter than that. It was the moment the lieutenant demonstrated, through a decision the men could observe and evaluate, that he was prioritizing their survival over his own need to appear authoritative. It might be accepting a route suggestion from the platoon sergeant instead of insisting on his own map reading. It might be calling a halt when something in the environment felt wrong, without a clear tactical reason he could articulate, and being vindicated by what happened next. It might be nothing more visible than asking the right questions and then listening to the answers without performing confidence he did not yet have. The men in Vietnam's platoons were not looking for charisma. They had seen enough charismatic officers who got people killed. What they were looking for was an officer who would not confuse map doctrine with ground truth in his first week, and take someone with him because of that confusion. The lieutenants who cleared that bar, who demonstrated, even imperfectly, that they understood the difference between the war they had been trained for and the war they were standing inside, became, over the following weeks, what their men needed. The ones who did not clear it disappeared from the unit in one of several ways: relieved of command, wounded and evacuated, killed in the field, and then the next lieutenant stepped off the next helicopter, and the evaluation started again. The Army did not ignore what this pattern was revealing, but fixing it required acknowledging that the rotation system itself was part of the problem, and the rotation system was not just a logistics policy. It was connected to career development, force structure, political constraints, and decades of institutional doctrine. You could not pull that thread without pulling several others at the same time. General Creighton Abrams, who took command of American forces in Vietnam in 1968, was among the senior officers who raised concerns about unit cohesion and the human cost of individual rotation. But the structural changes required to address those concerns fully were larger than what any single commander in theater could implement against the weight of the system producing them. The war ended, the Army came home, and then, over the following decade, it rebuilt itself, using the Vietnam experience as one of its primary reference points for what had gone wrong. The cohort program, cohesion, operational readiness, and training, attempted in the 1980s to keep soldiers in units longer, to reduce the personnel turbulence that Vietnam's individual rotation system had normalized, and to rebuild the unit identity that constantly cycling individuals in and out had systematically destroyed. Officer development programs placed greater emphasis on small unit leadership, on counterinsurgency awareness, on the human dimensions of command that classroom doctrine had never fully captured. The Army that deployed to the Persian Gulf in 1991 was, in measurable ways, a more cohesive fighting force than the one that had operated in Vietnam. Some of that improvement traced directly back to the lessons about what the first week of a new lieutenant revealed about the cost of treating people as interchangeable entries in a personnel management database. But the tension never fully resolved itself. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American officers again served on rotation schedules that balanced individual career development against operational continuity. The same debates about cohesion, knowledge transfer, and the specific vulnerability of leaders in their initial weeks in command recurred in after-action reviews, in military journal articles, and in the conversations of sergeants who had watched new officers arrive in a combat zone and begin the same process all over again. The platoon leader remained the most dangerous officer position in ground combat. The first weeks of command remained the highest risk period of the assignment. The structural reasons behind that pattern remained as much institutional as personal. Go back to the helicopter clearing one more time. The young officer, the new uniform, the studied map, the 30 men watching in silence. What those men were doing in those first seconds was not judging his character. They were calculating his risk, and their own. They had watched this before. They understood the system that had produced him and dropped him into their unit. They knew the pattern, the short command tour, the knowledge gap, the rotation math, that meant the officer slot above them would turn over again before the year was out. They were not hostile toward this particular lieutenant. Most of them were not hostile toward any of the lieutenants. They were waiting to find out whether this one understood, faster than most, that what he had been trained for and what he was standing inside were two fundamentally different things, and that the gap between those two things was where people died. The brutality of the first week in Vietnam was not the jungle. It was not the heat or the rain or the enemy in the tree line. It was the collision between an institution that needed career officers and a war that needed experienced ones, and the space between those two requirements was measured in men who did not survive their first 30 days. The lieutenants who made it through carried that week for the rest of their lives. Many of them became the colonels and generals who tried to build a different army in the years that followed. Whether they fully succeeded is a question still being answered every time a new officer steps off a helicopter into a place he has never seen, with men watching him and the clock already running. If you found this video useful, consider subscribing. There is a lot more where this came from. Strange military questions with answers that go deeper than they first appear. And if this topic left you with questions, drop them in the comments. The best ones become future videos.